I'm going to go ahead and do our intro, and then we'll get going. So, hi everyone! Thank you so much for joining us for this Parrot Analytics Live. My name is Rebecca Zabarski, and I'm the Director of Marketing at Parrot. Today, we have a really fascinating presentation prepared by our VP of Partner Insights, Renee Engelhardt. Hi, Renee.
Hello.
And if you're familiar with Parrot, you'll know that we specialize in measuring audience demand for content and talent. But today we're actually going to go a little deeper into audience analysis to see what kind of unique opportunities the data can reveal to us if we approach it from a different angle. So our webinar today is going to be about 20 minutes with 10 minutes reserved at the end for a Q&A, where we'll address the questions that you've already asked. You know, you had a chance to ask a question when you registered. We have a few of those. And then also we'll pick up as many as we can from the Zoom chat. And I will be running the chat. So if you have a question, I might answer with a link or, to the best of my ability. And then if there's something that Renee can answer during the call, if we have time, she can address that at the end. If not, we'll follow up with you to answer your question. And I just want to give a special shout out to our Demand 360 Lite and Enterprise customers. Thanks so much for joining us today. And also thank you to everyone from joining. If you're joining from very far away, we appreciate that you are here no matter what time zone you're in. I think it might be a late night for some folks. So let's get started. I'm going to disappear now. Renee, you can kick it off, and I'll come back on at the end for the Q&A.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Rebecca. So hi, everyone. I'm Renee Engelhardt, and I'm your host for today's webinar. So let's dive in. So at Parrot, we measure the attention economy, which is founded in the principle that time, or how and where we dedicate our attention, is a finite resource. And it's governed by the economic principles of supply and demand. So in the context of content, platforms, networks, brands, they're all essentially competing for your time. And our measurement systems capture and identify all of the supply that which audiences can engage with, be it a TV show, movies, talent, topic, brands. And then we measure the demand by capturing signals of audience engagement with that content. So these expressions of demand are collected from a variety of sources that you can actually see on the right-hand side of the slide. And they can range from research sites like Google, Wikipedia, P2P streaming, social media, and social video. So I'm actually not going to go into much detail about the derivation and significance of demand today, but rather the focus of this webinar is on affinity, which is a lesser known but equally important derivative of those data signals that go into demand. So affinity is really quantifying the synergies between audiences by essentially mapping or measuring the overlap of the audience of thing A, which can be content like a show, a movie, or a brand, to the audience of thing 2 or thing B, sorry, which is, again, can be a brand, a TV show, or a movie. And so during today, we'll go through some specific examples of measuring the content to content affinity, audience to content, brands to content affinity, and all of these you'll see applications across marketing, your content and programming strategies, and audience strategies. So in our first example, we're going to explore the applications of content to content affinity and how that can be used to prioritize your subscriber retention and acquisition strategies. So remember, at the core of the concept of affinity, we're really measuring the overlap of audiences. So when we speak of affinity in this context, in the context of content, we're measuring the overlap of the audience of one show to another show. So really, we're quantifying what else an audience is watching. So we'll start with an example of The Mandalorian. So as of today, these are the top 10 shows that the audience of The Mandalorian has a high affinity to, meaning that they're also watching these shows. You can see we've got some sci-fi, superhero, Marvel, Star Wars, Game of Thrones, some adult skewing comedies with Rick and Morty and Archer. And what you might have also noticed is that 4 of these top 10 shows are on Disney+, which also means that 6 of them are on other networks. And so this is a good time to just pause and think for a moment about the role or a purpose that a show serves to the platform or the network. So a show can typically serve one of two purposes, either to acquire new audiences, to draw them into the platform and be the reason for that audience to subscribe, or a show can be served to retain that subscriber on the platform and really ensuring that there's enough content for that subscriber to stay engaged on the platform. And so here, in thinking about how The Mandalorian and the purpose that it's really serving for Disney Plus, right now, it looks like just when we look at the top 10 shows, there's actually a pretty decent mix of Disney Plus other networks, but we know that that wasn't always the case. So when it launched, The Mandalorian premiered in 2019 at the same time that the Disney Plus platform was launching. And we took a look at the top 25 shows that the audience of The Mandalorian had the highest affinity to at launch. And you can see here, actually, none of them were from Disney Plus. I see 5 Amazon Prime videos. We've got a few Netflixes in there, BBC One, Apple TV Plus. And so it's really alarming to see that the audience of The Mandalorian showed a higher affinity to shows that were basically on other platforms except Disney Plus. And so that really means and indicates, and anecdotally we know, that The Mandalorian was serving to bring in a new audience base to the Disney Plus platform. But if this was sustained, or if this was another show on a different platform, different context, that could also have ramifications of subscriber churn if new releases to continue to bring in these isolated audiences that have a low affinity to the rest of a platform's catalog. And so we all know now that it's 2022 and we know the successes of Disney Plus, that really wasn't the case with The Mandalorian, and each subsequent tentpole launch on Disney Plus that was followed with WandaVision, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and then Loki. There is an increasingly number of shows that the audiences of those shows are showing a high affinity for on the Disney Plus network. And so we were just looking at the affinity of The Mandalorian to other shows, but as a platform is looking to acquire, develop new content, it's really key to understand the affinity of a show to the entire catalog to really ensure that it's going to fulfill its intended purpose as either an acquisition or retention driver. And so here what we've done is we've actually taken a few examples and calculated their affinity to some selected platforms catalogs as of today. So going through just a few examples with comedy shows, we've got Ted Lasso and It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. And what I think is really interesting in this example is that the affinity metric and calculation was able to pick up the slight nuances between these two shows that are within the same genre. So Ted Lasso is a bit more family friendly. And you can see that the platforms that have the highest affinity to it are Disney Plus and Paramount Plus, which are, again, they skew a bit more towards families, whereas It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, it has a bit more of an edge to it. It shows that it has a higher affinity to HBO Max and Showtime, and Disney Plus is actually lower down the list. Looking at the crime dramas, we've got Ozark and Peaky Blinders. Those are both shows that are on Netflix right now, and they both show a high a high affinity to the AMC Plus network as well as Showtime. And as we would probably expect with these two examples, and just to illustrate the point that the Disney Plus catalog is really at the lower end of the spectrum, and those two shows have a much lower affinity to Disney Plus. And so this was meant to really reflect and show that understanding what shows your audience is watching, and more importantly, where, as in which platforms and where else is that audience, that can really impact your subscriber acquisition and churn strategies. And ultimately, it can help contribute and determine the perceived value of content to a platform. So it's one thing to understand what your audience is watching, but it can even be more powerful when you understand the demographics of your audience based off of behavioral actions. So behavioral demographics go beyond those standard demographics of age, gender, income. And so in this next section, we're going to look at the applications of using social affinity networks to inform your audience strategy for marketing, targeting, or content. So we're going to use the House of Dragon as the example here. And for all of you non-Game of Thrones fans out there, the House of Dragon, it's a new show. It's coming out this August on HBO, and it takes place about 200 years before the time at which the Game of Thrones series is set. And so, as you can imagine, the show has already amassed a huge following. And so what we can do today is start to analyze who this likely audience of the show is going to be before it's even premiered by analyzing its social network. So we'll start with the social followers. And then what we do is we map the social network of these followers to understand who else and what else they follow. And then ultimately, we segment this audience into distinct taste clusters. So again, this then provides those insights into the shows, the movies, the brands, the people, influential figures, and helps identify what will resonate the most with each sub-segment of the audience, and how to engage with them for whatever the variety of priorities or objectives are. So to show you this in action, what we've done, and so we've clustered the entire fan base of the House of Dragons, and the resulting algorithm, or the algorithm, resulted in these 12 distinct and mutually exclusive, so there's non-overlapping audience segments. And each of these segments have their own unique combination of characteristics. So here we're looking at segment 12, which represents 21% of the total audience. And we've dubbed it the sci-fi show and movie fan segment. And so this is really the audience segment that is really interested in sci-fi, fantasy content. It's showing a high affinity to shows that are on Disney Plus. And if there's any sort of new superhero, new movies or show releases, they're on top of it. They're following that. And so knowing where this audience is and the type of content they engage with, marketers can then ensure that their placements are adjacent to this content and their digital presence. And as another example, so here we're looking at segment 6, and this is what we've dubbed the Game of Thrones diehard segment. And this is our Game of Thrones obsessive fans. They consume anything and everything Game of Thrones. They're all about the memes, the quotes, the facts, the rogue Starbucks cups that make it onto the set, and all the sub themes like winter is coming. And they have a very high fandom and following with the female cast members. So again, using this information, marketers or content creators can develop different content really tailored to a segment 6 audience versus a segment 12 audience. And so this can really inform how you can make more personalized marketing strategies and creative content to appeal to those various different segments. So as a summary, so far we've looked at content to content affinity and content to social affinity. So now as our third example, we're going to look at brand to content affinity and how that can be used to inform things like partnerships or product placements. And so for this example, we're going to use a luxury car brand that wants to identify which shows its customers are watching so that it can then determine where to advertise, as well as who they could cast in their commercials. So we've run this analysis and overlapping the car brand with content. And here we're plotting the resulting affinity and reach metrics in the scatter plot. So again, think of affinity as the similarity of audiences or the overlap of the car brand audience with the show audience, and that is on the x-axis. I'm introducing a new metric here. It's called reach on the y-axis, and think of that as the size of the audience. So titles with a high affinity but a low reach, those are the ones that are in the bottom right-hand quadrant. That's a really niche audience. There's a really high similarity between the car brand and the shows, but it's a very small audience. Conversely, in the top left, those are shows where there's a high reach, a large audience, but the overlap with the car brand is not as strong. And so let's zoom in that top right quadrant. So these are your ideal shows because there is a high affinity and a high reach. So this is your core audience that can scale. And perhaps not surprisingly for a car brand, we can see that there's quite a few car shows or the more prestigious auto related shows like Top Gear and Jay Leno's Garage. And just to point out as a converse example of that, if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, that's where you can see the shows whose audience is really not in the target audience of a luxury auto brand. So there we've got like Days of Our Lives, soap opera, some comedy shows, and like The Wilds, I think is like a teen show on Amazon. And so this can really inform and identify which shows or which audiences won't really be optimal for your initiatives. So we can apply the same framework, and now we're going to look at who and which talent they would want to cast and partner with rather than the shows. And so we can see that in the top right-hand quadrant, again, two talent that are popping are Richard Hammond, who was a former host of Top Gear, and Max Verstappen, who is a current Formula One driver for Red Bull. And that makes sense that they're in that top right-hand quadrant. Like that might be expected. They have a high association and connection to autos. But I want to point out John Ram, who is a professional golfer. And after doing some research on him, he's actually incidentally already sponsored by Mercedes. And he might not have naturally surfaced to the top of an auto-centric talent list. So this framework is really a great way to identify who or which shows would resonate the most of your brand, regardless of whatever type of demographics or like male skewing, female skewing. It can really be used to identify pockets of talent and shows that might not have been considered before. Of course, there's other criteria that we can put on top of this just to hone in on who that best match would be by filtering out people that are unavailable or that you just know are not a fit qualitatively. But sometimes using these metrics of both reach and affinity can be difficult to interpret or discern what the true ranking really is. And so to remedy that, we calculate a brand compatibility score, which applies a weighting to both of those metrics based off of whatever your priority or objective is. So for example, if you wanted to give a higher weight to affinity, if you wanted to go after that audience that is more similar with your brand, or you could weight reach higher if you really needed to scale and go after a larger audience and are willing to sacrifice the homogeneity of some of the more niche audience. So we'll look at this in action, going back to the auto shows and the overlap. So when we prioritized the brand compatibility score based off of affinity, meaning that we gave affinity a higher weight than reach, we can see that the top three shows based on brand compatibility are actually Fifth Gear, Wheeler Dealers, and Motor Week. Incidentally, they did have the highest affinity, but when we look at the reach index, that's where you can see Grand Tour, Formula One, and Top Gear ranked the highest. And so the compatibility score is really a great way to just come up with a definitive rank ordering and really discern which brand, talent, or show your content or brand is most compatible with. And so that's it. So as you've just seen, affinity can be a really powerful tool to provide insights into content to content strategies, audience strategies, and brand strategies. And it even gets more powerful when you fold back in that demand metric as another metric of consideration. But I'll save that for a future webinar. So with that, I guess, Rebecca, do we want to open it up for some Q&A?
Yeah, thank you. So we actually have some questions that were sent in beforehand. So I've got two of those that I think are an excellent start. And then I can see some people are asking some questions. So I'll go through those after you address these first two.
Sure.
So the first one I see is, what's the value of doing an affinity analysis of content if we've already acquired the content? I see value in looking at platform affinity before acquisition of a title to make sure we have an audience for it on our streaming platform, but what can we get out of it? What can we get out of doing it for shows that we already own?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. And so I would say there's probably about two really powerful reasons of why it's important to know the affinity of your current catalog and shows that you've already acquired. The first being that it provides visibility into what else your audience is watching across different platforms. I know that with a lot of these OTT platforms, the recommendation engines on if you watched this show, these are the other types of shows that we think you're most interested in. They have to base that primarily off of their own first party data. And what they could potentially be missing is all of your viewership and behaviors that are happening on other platforms. So for example, let's say like I only watch comedy shows on Netflix, but I watch true crime dramas on HBO Max. And so Netflix is going to keep recommending to me about all of these comedy dramas, but they're missing that complete picture that I'm also obsessed with true crime dramas. And so this is a powerful way to enhance and continue to inform those recommendation engines and some of your strategies of how an OTT platform would, I guess, not so much market to, but really start to communicate with their audiences about the full types of interests that they might have. The other reason that I love this topic is more about understanding exclusivity and non-exclusivity and how that can impact an OTT's platform. So if you think about it, there's shows that are exclusive to a single platform that you can only see on that platform, but then we know that there's a lot of various different licensing agreements between some of these bigger networks and platforms as they're starting to share content. So understanding that what's going to happen to your audience based off of if you have a show that you decide to change the licensing agreement for and also share it with another platform or make it exclusive to your own platform, you can then understand your audience behaviors of the ramifications of what would happen with that decision. So is that audience going to abandon ship and go to and just follow that show and go to the platforms where that show is? Or is your audience of that show going to stay loyal to your own platform because there is a high affinity to your platform and there's enough content to keep them engaged? And so that's why understanding, I would say those are the two biggest reasons of why understanding your current catalog's affinity is really important.
Awesome. There's another question here. This kind of goes back to the idea of taste clusters, which you mentioned earlier, especially in the social affinity. So the question is about the difference between taste clusters and demographics. It seems like demographics don't reveal as much insight about individuals or audiences, but they are still heavily relied on for advertising and marketing campaigns. What are the pros and cons of utilizing either, and when is it appropriate to use demographics?
Yeah, so demographics, I think they're widely accepted to use kind of more like the census variable. So think of like age, income, location, and they have historically been known and they're easy to explain to marketers and other types of advertisers and to really create profiles just based around the simple, age and gender. And so they can be very powerful, but that's where I think taste clusters can really enhance any sort of strategy because they're more based off of behavior actions rather than the description of a person of their age and gender and income. So when we think of taste clusters and the social affinity that we looked at before, we're deriving those essentially like personalities or descriptions about that audience based off of actual things that they're doing. They're following these audiences and they're engaging with them. And we can come with really specific descriptions of them. And so if you think of the House of Dragons example, in hindsight, we did show you two very kind of more of the obvious or transparent examples of the type of sub-segments that would be in that House of Dragons larger audience. But it's really some of those smaller, lesser obvious type segments where you can identify and really get specific about who that audience is and their taste preferences and what they engage with. And so it can really help really define and hone in on a strategy of how to target these various different segments instead of just taking a wider approach and a more generalized approach about the demographic segments.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought that was interesting to see the segments in the House of Dragon example, because you had selected the two very large ones, but in reality, you have lots of other smaller segments that have, I'm guessing, very niche and a wide variety of interests that you would miss out on if you're only looking at that census data, right, for traditional demographics.
Yeah,
We have
exactly.
another question. This is more basic to Affinity. The question is this: Affinity is a tool to talk about other contents for the same audience, but can Affinity change?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So Affinity can change based off of what is actually available to watch. And so it's really great to see when you analyze Affinity over time of when a show is first released, what else is that audience watching versus when, let's say it's a year after the release of that show, there's different content available in the market, there's different platforms. And so the evolution of the affinity of a show is really something important to understand, and the fluidity and how that could change week over week from when it's first launched to when it's been around for a lot longer. That's when you can really understand who is that audience that was there at the start and who is that audience that is there now in duration. So that's a really great analysis to get underneath the evolution of how affinity changes.
And that was the example you shared in the beginning, right? Like the Mandalorian. I mean, that affinity changed from the very beginning when it debuted, and then looking at it later.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Okay, we have one more question. I'm kind of adapting it from what people are asking in the chat. So if we don't get to your question, we will follow up afterwards. We've got just about 2 more minutes. But this question is about content that is completely unknown, right? So like it's maybe a new concept. So we've been talking about concepts that exist because we're looking at these shows, like the content that already exists. Can you do this type of affinity on new concepts or shows that have not been developed or rather produced or out there yet? How would you even go about doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, that can be done. If you remember the second slide in this presentation where we showed the supply and the demand. So with measuring and capturing demand and all the sources and signals that would go into the affinity metric as well, we are capturing all of the descriptive fields about content. And so if you have a concept that is yet to be released, what we can do is actually identify based off of some of those key concepts, or we refer to them as genes from our content genome. We can create our own hypothetical show of pulling data from various different comp titles and create this, essentially, it's a ghost title. And then run the affinity off of this ghost title to understand what potentially demand could look like, but then also the affinity, and where we think the taste clusters would appear for that type of an audience. So it's as long as you identify those specific genes about that concept, then we can build essentially a lookalike show for that and then calculate affinity and demand off of that.
Amazing. I feel like that sounds like maybe our next Parrot Analytics Live.
That would be a great topic of concept testing.
Is looking at another webinar. Very cool.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Renee. We are at time. So this was a 30-minute webinar today. Thank you everyone for joining. We have one more thing. I don't know if we have, yeah, cool. So we always offer a 30% discount to our Entertainment Analytics Suite, Demand 360 Lite. So I'm gonna share that code. There's a link here. I'll share that in the chat. So this is our platform that shows you global content analytics for TV and talent and movies very soon. So a lot of, let's see here. There we go. There's the link if you want to use that for 30% off. What you get over 50,000 TV shows, movies, talent, and you can see their global rankings. So that's all of the demand data that Renee was mentioning earlier. And we also do show some affinity data within Demand 360. So you can see that content to content affinity that Renee was talking about where we see, okay, The Mandalorian, what else were people watching? What is the affinity of The Mandalorian with other titles? So that's also part of Demand 360 Lite. So you can use that link and also learn more about the product within that link. But again, we want to thank you all for joining. We really appreciate you coming. We'll be doing another Parrot Analytics Live next month. So stay tuned. We'll share more details about that. And again, thanks so much. It was great to see everyone. Thank you, Renee.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Awesome.
You nailed it.